Well, anytime anyone in the federal Liberal government talks about Canada's economy, they seem to be very optimistic. They always talk about how Canada's economy is growing, and that's something that we should all be excited about.
Wages have been outpacing inflation for 18 months in a row.
But it doesn't really feel that way, does it? Not only does it not feel like Canada's economy is doing well, but the statistics also do not back up any of those claims. Young Canadians, it appears, can barely find any entry level work these days. Canada's GDP per capita is decreasing, and Canada's housing starts are also decreasing. So, how exactly can anyone claim that Canada's economy is doing well right now when quite clearly the opposite is true? Well, joining us now on the show is Russell Matthews, a Canadian financial YouTuber, commentator, and real estate agent. Russell, thank you so much for joining the show.
Thanks for having me here, Harrison. It's nice to meet you, and I've been looking forward to chatting.
Appreciate that, and likewise. I want to first start off with the news that came out of Ontario last week. The province has once again raised the minimum wage at a time when youth unemployment figures are down. Now, what does this decision mean for workers in Ontario?
Yeah, well, I think for most workers, especially those that are in that sort of minimum wage range for their jobs, it's definitely a welcome change for them, right? Going up to $17.20 or $17.20 an hour, up from $16.50, I think it was, or roughly that, like a 4% increase. But I think you'd probably be hard pressed to find anybody for which that's going to be a super meaningful difference in their lives, right? Definitely welcome, but the reality is it's a marginal increase relative to the surge in the cost of living that we've seen over the past number of years.
Do you think that this will result in more younger workers being able to get into the job market? Because we know how tight it is for so many young people in this country. We've heard the stories, people saying they just can't find an entry level job anymore. For whatever reason, you're not getting those looks for those entry level jobs. So does this decision change that? Or do you think that it might have a negative impact for access to jobs?
Yeah, it's tough to know for certain, right? We'll definitely watch how it plays out going forward. But I'd argue that it's likely not the minimum wage that's being paid to young workers that's resulted in the challenge with them ending up being able to get jobs, especially in those sort of entry level jobs that they need to build their experience. I wouldn't say that a lower or a slightly higher minimum wage would have too heavy an impact on their job prospects. I think far more some of the changes that have been made to the temporary foreign worker program, along with sort of what has happened there over the past number of years, in my eyes at least, would be have a larger impact on young Canadians' job prospects.
So let's get into that a little bit. How has immigration changed the economic landscape in Canada for not just those entry level jobs, but also we're increasingly hearing about high skilled work, the high skilled temporary foreign worker system, or program rather, really impacting the job market. Talk to us more about that, because it's one thing for people like myself to talk about it, but I don't really have that background in economics as you do. So what has this immigration program, the expansion of the temporary foreign worker program, and all the other programs that come along with that, what has that done to the economic landscape in Canada?
Yeah, so let's start with just talking about the temporary foreign worker program in general. Maybe we'll get more into the high skill aspect of it later, something I'm not as familiar with. But a quick sort of recap of the past few years, perhaps, about what's happened here with the temporary foreign worker program. Well, we saw large scale reports of labor shortages in around 2021. You'll remember all kinds of signs. We can't find workers. There's nobody here to fill in these business or to help these businesses do what they need to do. So there were some changes made by the government to allow for more temporary foreign workers to be able to fill those positions, right? There's this idea that makes sense because it helps Canadian businesses thrive, and if there's nobody to work, then how can these businesses grow? That's sort of a questionable conversation that we can sort of get into more. But I believe that these changes were made by the political and financial elite because they sort of are scared of this concept of a wage price spiral. You have to also look back to the economic climate that we're in 2021, especially into 2022 with record high inflation. One of the worries of the central bank and the federal government is that if they allow wages to keep on growing without equal productivity growth, that they could see something called a wage price spiral, where that drives inflation up even more, which is the main goal that the Bank of Canada was trying to fight against. The idea being that if you have to pay people more to work at your business, then those costs are going to be added into the product and expanded and sort of passed on to the consumer. So the idea is if we can reduce inflation by preventing a wage price spiral. I think that is the sort of framing of a well-meaning government or a well-meaning central bank to try to serve the interests of Canadians. What ended up happening, though, I think was something that drove down wages in general, because now all of a sudden there's a huge amount of labor supply in the market that people can have access to. And that obviously leads to some issues when it comes to younger Canadians getting these entry-level jobs, because all of a sudden they're not the only ones competing for those jobs, and there are additional incentives for people to take those jobs because maybe they're not here just for the pay, but additional points to help with a permanent resident status.
Part of a new phenomenon, really, you can say, that we've seen with this mass expansion of the available labor supply in Canada has been the prevalence of black market and under the table work. I want to ask you, what role does the black market under the table economy play when wage hikes are imposed, and how might this lead to an increase in off the books employment and job insecurity?
Yeah, I think that we've seen a large amount of fraud in the system by all reports. Talking specifically about labor market impact analysis jobs, this program that was essentially designed to make sure that no other Canadian could fill a job before temporary workers were able to take on those roles. Now, I think that that's a well-meaning program, one that makes a lot of sense. If you can prove that there's no Canadians to fill a position, then it makes sense to bring someone in to help out that business. But has been a lot of questionable practices in this space, right? People putting up job postings and putting them on job pages that aren't actually seen by applicants or aren't used by applicants for jobs, allowing them to say, hey, nobody applied, so we can bring people in. This is one of the areas of fraud that we've seen. Additionally, we've heard of immigration consultants selling labor market impact analysis jobs, LMIA jobs, to people to help them boost their standing when it comes to the permanent residence application. If you have a job secured, then that's going to boost your ability to get resident status in Canada. And it turns out there's a cost to that, or a black market price that people were willing to pay in order to make sure that they get that job instead of somebody else. Now, it goes a lot deeper than that, but ultimately we've seen the Liberals backpedaling on this immigration policy, saying we're going to slow down this temporary foreign worker program. We recognize that Canadians are saying, hey, maybe this isn't sustainable, but ultimately I don't know how much of an impact these changes are going to have, given the fraud in the system and the fact that a lot of the businesses that were making use of this program weren't doing so above board, and the government also didn't have the resources to check to make sure that they were doing it above board. Now, are these changes going to actually slow things down, or is it going to make people sort of turn to doing more things off the books? I think we're going to have to wait and see.
Well, because of one of the obvious consequences of that has been that a lot of young people are out of work, and whenever that is the case, we usually start to hear more about universal basic income. It starts to be talked about more often. And 2 weeks ago, an NDP member of Parliament proposed a universal basic income piece of legislation. I want to ask you: do you see a situation in Canada's future in which a UBI, a universal basic income, could become a reality?
Do I see a future? Yeah, I see a future where that could certainly happen. Then we have to have the conversation: is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
Yeah.
Right? I think in a lot of cases, if you look at this in okay, everybody's a well-intentioned actor in the system, it kind of makes sense, right? I can see the argument for it. People should be able to live and have ability to sort of pay for food and to be able to pursue work, but also their passions, and maybe take risks in order to build businesses that you wouldn't have taken if there wasn't that social safety net. I think that these ideas are good ideas in principle. But when I see what happens when good ideas are put into practice in ineffective ways, that's what makes me a little bit more cautious, right? We've seen all kinds of funding programs, be it the sort of green slush fund that's been in the news, or some of the rent-a-feather indigenous programs and funding that we've seen there, as reported by Global News. We've seen that sometimes the funds that are put towards a given goal don't actually achieve that goal and are subject to possible corruption or just ineffective application of those ideas. So in a perfect world, I think it could be a good thing, but I haven't seen the evidence to convince me that it would be free of corruption and free of any issues on that front. But do I see a future where it could happen? I definitely do.
You know, whenever members of the Justin Trudeau government talk about the economy, and I'm thinking specifically about Chrystia Freeland here, they always sound so optimistic somehow. And whenever we talk to Canadians about this, they never share that optimism. It's always everybody feels pretty down about the economy, at least the people that I speak to. And the question I have for you now is Canada in a recession? Because I think for a lot of people, it does feel that way.
Yeah, and I think a lot of people might feel a little bit confused about why it feels that way, right? We see leaders around the world doing this, right? But pointing to, look, our economy is growing. If you look at the top level GDP numbers, by all accounts, Canada's economy is growing. But I don't believe that that top level economic number is an accurate reflection of the day-to-day realities of actual people. I don't think it's a reflection of how an economy is actually serving the people within it. Rather, it's more of a vanity metric in my eyes. What I like to look at personally is GDP per capita, or a country's productivity, to sort of be a better analog between how people are actually experiencing an economy versus just the headline numbers. And it's a vastly different story when we talk about GDP per person, as opposed to GDP. While we've seen GDP grow, largely, I believe, as a result of the immigration changes in the temporary foreign worker program, we saw the GDP grow. The economy is growing, but on a per person basis, it's shrinking, right? We're adding more people to marginally increase the entire country's GDP, but on a per person basis, that reflects how a person experiences their quality of life. That's actually been shrinking over the past number of years. So in reality, it feels like a recession for sure, even though the definition of a recession, a declining GDP over a number of different quarters, maybe we haven't seen that. But it certainly feels like it, and for Canadians experiencing it, it's more real than the top line GDP numbers.
I've heard economists talk about Canada's declining productivity and pointing to the fact that our declining productivity is a serious problem. But I find it hard to conceptualize what exactly that means and what and why Canada's productivity is declining. Can you explain in a bit more detail what that means on a day-to-day basis and exactly why Canada's productivity has dropped so into such a dangerous territory?
Yeah, I think that that's a challenging question. The later question that you posed there, why exactly are we struggling with this? I have some ideas, some hypotheses that we can get into, but first a sort of explanation of productivity and how we get to that. The idea of productivity is that if you can make every individual worker in a country produce more valuable outputs, then that's going to result in a higher standard of living, and more GDP growth in a country, which by all accounts is a good thing. And how do you do that? Well, you can invest in workers and getting them more skilled so that they can perhaps do something more quickly that they were doing slowly before. You can invest in tools, invest in automation, meaning that one person can do the job of five because now we have access to these more advanced tools. It's investment in these sort of research and development ideas that I think can help with productivity. Interestingly, the conversation we were just having about the sort of suppression of wages and tampering in the labor market, I think personally, this is my hypothesis, that could have a negative impact on productivity in Canada. Because if you have artificially low wages, and some even fraudulent below minimum wage payments, with the LMIA issues that we've talked about in the past, and I'm sure you've talked about with your viewers as well, yeah, it gets to be a challenge, right? Because when you have these issues where the government is coming in and editing the labor market, then there are some serious problems. Yeah, maybe do you want to direct me in another direction here? I can keep going.
Yeah. No, I mean that I think helps to conceptualize what that means, because in my perspective, when I hear about productivity, it's hard to understand exactly what is being discussed in that instance. Now, I think I want to switch gears now to housing, because this is something I know you speak quite a lot about, and it's obviously something that is top of mind for many Canadians.
Sure.
And housing starts have managed to decline. They keep declining, it appears, at a time when demand for housing, at least in my eyes, has never been higher. How is it possible that housing starts are declining in this country?
Yeah, and this is something that a lot of people are pointing to and saying, "Hey, this is a little bit odd, right? We haven't seen this recently. This is something that the current government is saying, hey, we need to do something to make sure that more housing starts happen." The government has one strategy. I'm not sure if that's the best strategy, but we'll get into that in a moment. For housing starts, I believe that the main reason that we're not seeing them is because chiefly it's not as profitable for developers right now, given the higher interest rates that we're experiencing. These people need to take on construction loans, different kinds of loans to actually develop this housing, alongside all kinds of different development charges levied by municipalities and provinces where those apply. It makes it more challenging to produce a home that there's actual buyers in the market for, right? I think that there's record demand in the market, but I just don't think that there's demand in terms of the people who have dollars to pay for housing at a price where it is profitable for those developers. This is the challenge, right? We've let housing prices grow and grow and grow, and now all of a sudden, those wages that people are earning can't support the loans that they're trying to get to buy this housing. So interestingly, the government says, okay, well, what we're going to do then is we're going to make it easier for Canadians to take on more debt, specifically high leverage debt. They've expanded the maximum amount of mortgage that you can take on when you have an insured mortgage. These are people that have anywhere from 5, 10, 15% as a down payment versus the 20% plus. These are people that don't have as much equity in their home right off the top. What they're saying is, hey, we're going to let those people take on more debt more easily so that they can buy these homes that that developers are trying to sell off. They can pay those higher prices that will then make it profitable for the developers. And if they know that they can sell to this new surplus of demand, then perhaps housing starts will tick up. Again, as interest rates come down, I think that would happen naturally anyways. And there might even be an argument that the pendulum is swinging that way already, and we have a tendency to overshoot with our policies because it takes so long for government to recognize what's really happening. But I guess we'll see if this is too much sort of stimulus or not enough.
And is that kind of in relation to your most recent video where you're discussing this bailout that is taking place, this kind of secret bailout that is taking place for Canada's top banks? I want to give you a chance to explain that and explain that concept in more detail, because when I was watching the video, it was hard to believe. So can you explain more about what the secret bailout is?
Yeah, I think it's a bailout on multiple fronts for multiple different parties, not just the big banks in Canada. But I think that there's a lot of convenient solutions that are happening all at the same time to either make people look good or to make banks more stable, right? In the video, I talk about how, okay, the government has sort of slowed down temporary foreign worker program. They need another way to prop up GDP numbers, and I think that's why there's been a lot of the mortgage changes that we've seen. Canada is an economy of housing, and as housing grows, or as there's more activity in housing, Canada's GDP grows. I think that that's a bailout that the government is sort of giving itself through policy, right? We're going to prop up our GDP numbers so we can continue to say our economy is looking good. Now, when it comes to the big banks, there are you may know that there's something called a capital reserve requirements that banks have to adhere to, essentially for the amount of sort of debt and the things that they've loaned out. They need to have a certain amount of what they call risk weighted relative to their risk weighted assets. They have to have a certain amount of cash on hand at all times, to make sure that there's a buffer there for stability, right? We have the deposits for Canadians that want to take out their money. It seems to me that there has been a little bit of a challenge here, because these big banks, at the end of each day, need to meet these capital reserve requirements, and it seems like they're having a harder and harder time doing so. Traditionally, what they've done is lent and borrowed between each other to hit these capital reserve requirements on a night-to-night basis. This is called the overnight repo market, where banks will lend to and from each other. We're seeing the central bank now, the Bank of Canada, open up more and more programs that also allow the banks to borrow from the Bank of Canada, specifically to help them, in my eyes, meet those capital reserve requirements. Now, I think that this is a complex thing that not a lot of people are thinking about, and cynically, some people may say that perhaps that complexity is by design so that you don't have more and more Canadians questioning, how does our system actually work? And perhaps I'm misinformed on it, but I would certainly love policymakers and central banks to come out and more readily explain themselves on these types of things, because certainly over the past few years, we're all feeling the impacts of the decisions made by these centralized organizations, be it the government or the central banks.
Absolutely. And well, we've been able to cover quite a lot of ground there, Russell, and we appreciate you explaining to us some of what's been going on and giving us your insight into the situation with housing, the general state of the economy, minimum wage, and all of that. We really appreciate it. Where can Canadians find your work, Russell?
Yeah, the best place is right here on YouTube if you're watching it here, or head over there if you're not. Yeah, you can just look up Russell Matthews, RussellMatthews. You'll find my videos there, making Canadian focused content, and do my best to make sense of things that don't make a lot of sense. So I'm doing my best to do that. So follow along.
Absolutely, and I think we need more of that, so we really appreciate it. To everyone watching, you can find a link to Russell's YouTube channel in the description of this video as well. With that, Russell, thanks again.
Beautiful. Thanks so much, Harrison.